The Department of Investigation's core mission is transparency and integrity. We run a system of inspectors general that look at the entire city and look to make sure that city operations go on honestly and fairly and efficiently. But it's also important that we have transparency, that everyone who works in New York and lives in New York understands what government is doing.
We are always looking at new ways to make the city more efficient and more effective in providing the services it does.
It's essential to ensure that our citizens' taxpayer money is being spent wisely and that corners aren't cut. It keeps our public officials honest. It keeps our city government functioning.
There's a lot of money in city government, and a lot of people, millions of people, depend on that money being spent efficiently. Children go to school, people drive on roadways, we cross bridges, we need medical care. You know, all those things in a city this size cost a lot of money. If you don't fight corruption, there's going to be people waiting to take advantage of that.
The biggest thing that happens when there's corruption is you get resignation by the city, that not everybody has to play by the rules. The result of that, especially over time, is that government isn't nearly as effective as it should be and could be.
The taxpayers and the public that's funding the government, that's supporting programs, want to know that there's someone watching out for their interests, watching out to make sure that their money is used wisely, effectively, efficiently, that programs are well run, and that there's accountability.
People who work for the government and employed by governmental agencies are accountable to the people that they serve. And it's important to have somebody watching to make sure that the rules, regulations, and policies are being followed.
Because of all the moving parts, and because of all the money that changes hands between governmental agencies and nonprofits and other agencies that receive public funds, we need to have independent and rigorous oversight of how this money is being used.
DOI is so key in rooting out public corruption in individual cases and making the victims, the public, whole again, but it also instills the public trust, knowing that DOI is out there watchfully.
We all expect and have a right to expect a government that is free of fraud and corruption and abuse. And DOI is the lead investigative agency for the City of New York to make sure that fraud, waste, and corruption are rooted out in all the many agencies that operate in New York City.
The strength of DOI is first and foremost its independence, and the fact that the commissioner is set up to be an independent actor within city government, able to investigate cases wherever she or he feels that they need to go. And some of the executive order powers are also really part of its strengths. The fact that people have to come forward if they work for the city and report corruption. They can't just put their head in the sand and pretend that it's not happening.
To have an inspector general system where you have people who are in the agency, who have their ear to the ground, who get to know personnel, who get to know programs, who get to know the people who are there, so it will make it much more likely that they will either become aware of what's going wrong, or the people in the agency will come to them and say, listen, you know, this bothers me a little, maybe it's nothing.
We have 11 squads that have a number of inspectors general. Each one is assigned to particular city agencies or entities and become experts in those city agencies. They know the substantive areas. If they're in charge of the Department of Buildings, they know what the Department of Buildings employees do. If they're in charge of the Administration for Children's Services, they know what those child protective services workers and preventive services workers that are charged with doing. That expertise goes from the inspectors general down to the investigators on their staffs.
I think you have great detectives, great investigators all throughout the city, great federal agents, city agents, but you do not have the expertise that sits within the four walls of DOI in how city government runs, how money is spent, how contracts get let, how people get hired.
With the cases that DOI does, a lot of times it's looking at waste and inefficiency, and then sometimes you find out that the waste and inefficiency is deliberate.
As is the case with most oversight resources, DOI was itself the result of a huge scandal.
It's fascinating in retrospect to reflect on the absolutely massive plundering that this guy, Boss Tweed, was able to do after the Civil War in New York City. I mean, the estimates are that he and his henchmen stole at least $200 million. Today, that would be over $4 billion, which would be 5% of the city budget.
In essence, what the Tweed ring was doing in the 1870s in New York was siphoning off money from city contracts, and they were caught ultimately by a disgruntled whistleblower who went to the papers.
The New York Times, which wasn't as big a newspaper then as it is now, played a huge role in publicizing the fraud that was going on. They got a hold through an insider to one of the real set of books, and they started writing about it. And then Thomas Nast, the great cartoonist, started hammering away with these really incisive cartoons, and together they were able to basically get the law enforcement to do something, to address it.
The city, the public reacted very badly to this ongoing and quite audacious graft that had been going on in city government on the part of the mayor, the finance director, the comptroller of the city of New York.
You know, the great edifice of the Tweed era still stands just a few blocks away, the Tweed Courthouse, which is this magnificent building on Chambers Street. It was supposed to cost, I think, about $250,000. It ended up costing 50 times that.
They, were siphoning money away from such projects as the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, which is just extraordinary to think about.
But at that point, there was no internal city mechanism to address these things. And that's where the initial push to create what was called Commission of Accounts at that point came from, what eventually became the Department of Investigation. I think that, that opened the door at least to having the right to be able to look over the shoulder of the other city agencies.
DOI has been around for over 140 years. And that's important not just as a sort of historical artifact, but because it means that with every administration, with every generation, we're able to build on the work of those who came before us.
One of the things we bring to the city and to do good governance that I don't think any other agency does is our ability to see across the city rather than merely reactively arresting people when we see a crime has been committed. We are able to proactively look at how we can best protect New Yorkers.
DOI is essentially the same agency that it has always been, in that its job is to detect and deter misconduct. Simple as that. The kind of misconduct is going to change.
We've had to adapt. We even see how bribes are paid these days. It's not necessarily $100 in an envelope. It may be that they're paying for the inspector's cell phone or the cell phone for him and his wife. We're always going to be changing our tactics depending on what we see and what we hear.
It's just a revolving door. If you don't fix it, it's just going to keep happening again and again. And the brilliant thing about DOI, I mean, one of the really brilliant things is that DOI has the ability to determine what controls ought to be in place in these agencies to prevent misconduct.
When we think about big system change and we think about vulnerabilities in city agencies, we're not just thinking about the bribe that happened between one worker and somebody who needs the A in their restaurant, for example. We're talking about the systemic vulnerabilities that allow that to happen. And so as an agency, we are able to issue policy recommendations, and we work with our city agencies to ensure that they implement those recommendations, and we create system change.
Many times after a criminal investigation, sort of as a follow-up to really be sort of a dissection of what didn't work, and then offering alternatives in terms of how an agency might proceed in the future.
Not only have we arrested dozens of corrections officers for smuggling contraband into Department of Corrections facilities, including Rikers, but we have also issued reports that led to a change in the way that those officers were screened on their way into facilities.
In New York City alone, you have a very unique situation with 2 federal prosecutors, 5 district attorneys, state attorney general, and others who have investigative authority. However, it is so huge and there's so much going on that it would be impossible for those prosecutors and investigative authorities to do the work that DOI does.
And in each sector, we simply need to have a DOI overseeing those sectors to make sure that where crime and fraud occurs, that they can step in and get right in there and help us root it out.
DOI sheds light. It sheds light on what doesn't work. It sheds light on what does work, different aspects of the problems that don't work, and what the potential solutions are for making it work better.
It is an institution, not just a commission or a once in a while type of investigative function.
There would be so much more misconduct and so much more corruption if we didn't have something like DOI.
I think that DOI's legacy is a combination of increased integrity and increased transparency. And it's both on the micro level, the idea that we are finding corrupt officials, we're finding them, we're rooting them out, we're making government more honest. But it's also on the macro level, that we are part of making sure that government thinks carefully about how it goes about its business, how it goes about doing this fairly and equitably and efficiently. And so we're not simply looking at, is there this one contractor that we are going to arrest for manslaughter? But are there changes in the way that the Department of Buildings oversees the construction industry to keep it safer for everybody? And so I think our legacy is not only greater honesty on a micro level, but a rethinking of how government delivers its services fairly and efficiently on a broader sense.